Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's lectures in microbiology. These videos are intended for use by students who are enrolled in my Microbiology for Health Science course or Biology 2420 at Del Mar College. If anyone else out there in YouTube land finds these videos helpful, by all means please hit like and subscribe or let me know through some feedback. Now, in our first video we were discussing some of the general terminology that we're going to use in microbiology and some of the terms we're going to refer to on a regular basis. Please learn all that terminology. We're going to start looking at how organisms are classified and the history of microbiology in this video. Now we're going to talk about a subject called taxonomy. Taxonomy is the classification system of living organisms. How do we classify living organisms? It's important that we classify living organisms because if I have an organism, for example, let's say I find some bugs. This is just sort of a brief introduction. And on one of the bugs, I notice that there's 3 body parts. Each part has a pair of legs, and sometimes they have antennae. And we decide that we're going to call these insects. I have another organism that has 2 body parts with 8 legs and a bunch of eyes. And we're going to call these arachnids. And when I study biology, I can study insects and arachnids, right? Which both fall under the category of animals. Now, when I start to study them in great detail, let's say I go on adventure somewhere in South America and I see this really unique, interesting this interesting bug, and I notice that this bug has 2 body parts and has 8 legs and a whole bunch of eyes, but it looks unlike anything I've ever seen before. Well, I know that it's an arachnid, and when I know arachnids are spiders, all exhibit certain behaviors. Many of them build a web, and they can spin silk into a web, and they can how they eat, how they digest, and then I already know a whole bunch about this organism. I know it's not one of these, so I know a lot about its anatomy, its physiology, its behaviors, and other things. If I find another bug, and it's got a lot of body parts, and every body part has a pair of legs on it, and it has some antennae, then I know it's probably an insect. And I know a lot about insects and how different they are from arachnids. So the ability to categorize organisms allows us to understand all the similar traits that those organisms have and how they differ from other living organisms. And when I discover a new organism, I can figure out where it sits in all of our classification system and all the taxonomical system within the taxonomy of living organisms. Okay? Now, the father of taxonomy was a guy named Carolus Linnaeus, okay? And I actually always misspell his name, and I have for years, so I want to make sure I get it right for you guys, okay? I always have a habit of leaving one of the N's out, but Carolus Linnaeus, back in like 1735, I believe it was one of the first guys to start classifying organisms into different categories. And this was the birth of what we call taxonomy. And he came up with this classification system. The classification system eventually ends up naming most of the organisms by what we call the genus and species. And we tend to either write the genus and species in italics or we underline them when we can. So when you talk about an organism, the names that we give these organisms is based on what we call the genus and species, right? And these are very specific ways that these organisms can be categorized. For example, for humans, we are called Homo sapiens. We belong to the genus Homo, which are a bunch of hominids, usually upright things and things that use their hands, and sapiens, intelligence. Or if we talk about certain bacteria, there's one called Escherichia coli. Escherichia was a whole group of bacteria that were discovered by a scientist that shared a similar name, and the coli means that they come from our colon, okay? So if we look at another one, we could look at something that's called Staphylococcus, okay? When we talk about Staphylococcus, the name tells us a whole bunch. So when we talk about staff means cluster. So this is a cluster of cells. And the coccus tells us that they are round shaped. And we're going to do some of this terminology again later, so you don't need to memorize that right now. And the aureus comes from gold, which is why we abbreviate gold as AU. Okay? So when we talk about organisms, we usually name them by their genus and their species. Homo sapiens, Escherichia coli, Staphylococcus aureus, Klebsiella pneumoniae, or something like, I don't know, I can't think of another one right now, but anyway, you guys understand that when we look at this stuff, we're talking about the genus and the species. In a textbook, we will either put it in italics, and when we can't do italics, we underline the genus and species. The genus is always capitalized, the species usually is not. Now, what do we mean by all of this, okay? So, when it comes to the classification of organisms, there's a funny sentence that is taught in biology class, and it says, did King Philip come over from Great Spain? And there's a number of different sentences. You can come up with your own, but if you take the first letter of each one of these words and come up with a funny way of saying it, then you can think of what it really means in the taxonomy. When we talk about taxonomy, we're going to talk about the domain. All living organisms fall under three major domains. One of them is called Archaea. Archaea is very ancient cells, very similar to prokaryotes. Okay. Another major classification is going to be prokaryotes, or bacteria, which I should say is most prokaryotes. So we have Archaea, we have bacteria, and then we have eukaryotes, which is eukaryotic cells. Okay. So when we talk about the domain, we're talking about three major umbrellas that all living organisms can fall under. They're either going to be Archaea, which used to be called Archaebacteria, but we now know that they're their own domain. So we call them Archaea, call them bacteria, or we call them eukaryota. Okay, so or eukarya, meaning those cells that have organelles. Now, each domain can be broken up into a kingdom. Okay? So, there's three major domains, and those domains can be broken up into individual kingdoms. So, when it comes to bacteria, that domain is also the kingdom, so is Archaea. But when it comes to eukarya, we can break eukarya, or truly celled organisms with a true nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, into a whole bunch of other categories. There's Protista, there's Plantae, there's Fungi, and there's Animalia. Okay? So now we have 6 kingdoms. We have 3 domains: Archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. And then Archaea is its own kingdom also. Bacteria are their own kingdom. And then the other 4 kingdoms would be Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista, which are single-celled animals. Okay? Now, each one of those kingdoms can be broken into subcategories that we call phyla. And you'll see this term phyla, which is plural, or phylum, which is singular. Okay? So organisms can be broken into different phyla or phylums. And so as we go from the higher levels and we break it down, we're getting more and more and more specific. Okay? So each kingdom can be broken into many different phyla, and so those organisms can be categorized more specifically. And then after phyla, we get to a class of organisms. Within each phyla, there are many, many different classes of organisms. So if I'm looking at a specific phylum like Chordata, anything that has a spinal cord, then I have different classes of those chordates. Okay? After class, we get into order. So each class can be broken into a number of different orders. Within each order, there are many families. And then we get to genus and species. So when we talk about the taxonomy of organisms, and we're talking about the genus and species, we really technically could go through every one of these. If I gave you an organism, we could literally list what is the domain it would be found under. Within that domain, which specific kingdom does it belong to? Which phylum within that kingdom does it belong to? Which class within that phylum does it belong to? Which order, and then which family, and then genus and species. We usually just list these two. These are the two that we pay attention to when we talk about things like Homo sapiens, or Escherichia coli, or Staphylococcus aureus, or forget that. I can't think of the name of the gray wolf. Anyway, but as we organize all these, as we classify these organisms, what we're learning is there's three major groups that share certain characteristics. But within that group, there are subgroups that have characteristics that are somewhat unique to a certain individuals, and we break those down into kingda and then phyla, and we get more and more specific in their characteristics as we go through all of this. So I expect you guys should know all the levels of taxonomy that are listed here, okay? And know that we always use genus and species. We always give, or we usually refer to an organism by two names, which would be the genus and species, which is very specific under all these other categories, okay? Now, when we talk about the types of microbes, we need to talk about the different types of microbes that we can study. And then later on, we're going to go in and name some of these genus and species, or geni and species, and whatever. So, when we talk about the different types of microorganisms that we could talk about, we classify them, or we're not necessarily talking about classifications, but just basic types of organisms. So one of the types of organisms we will talk about will be called the Archaea, okay? And all those organisms that we refer to as Archaea share certain characteristics. Excuse me. Sometimes my throat gets dry as I talk, so I need to take a drink. And if you see me stepping off screen, that's why. Okay. So when we talk about Archaea, there's a number of characteristics that you need to know that all Archaea share. Okay. First of all, these are defined as prokaryotes. Well, from our previous lecture, we know that prokaryotes means that they have no membrane-bound nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles. It's essentially a membrane or cell wall or both with some DNA, some cytoplasm, and some ribosomes. And that's about it. They don't have a whole lot of organelles. But what's unique about Archaea is that they have some eukaryotic traits. For example, some of the Archaea have what we call a flagellum. A flagellum is a long whip-like tail that requires specific proteins within it that allows for what we call motility, or allows for them to swim through a solution. Like a sperm cell has a flagellum that allows it to swim. And so some Archaea have flagella, which usually flagella are somewhat unique to eukaryotes, not most prokaryotes, okay? Another characteristic that we need to know about the Archaea is that they have a cell wall, okay? So we're going to talk about the difference between a cell membrane, which is a lipid bilayer with the complex mixtures of proteins and carbohydrates and cholesterol. And then there's cell walls, and the cell wall is another structure that can exist outside the cell membrane that can be made up of different substances depending on what type of organism it is. One of the things we know about Archaea is that their cell wall lacks proteoglycans or peptidoglycans, okay? So, they have no proteoglycans or peptidoglycans in their cell wall, okay? No proteoglycans or no peptidoglycans in their cell wall, okay? Well, that's important to know, because some of the organisms we're going to look at are going to have a cell wall, and what classifies them or helps us identify them as this type of organism is what is exactly the cell wall made up of. So that's somewhat important to know. You should know these two details. I can ask this stuff on exam questions. Which type of organism or microorganism is considered a prokaryote that has some eukaryotic characteristics and can have a cell wall with no proteoglycans, you would know we're talking about archaea. Now, one of the things we know about archaea also is that they can often survive or be found in extreme environments. And they belong, sometimes there's a class of them that we call extremophiles. The phile part means to love, and so like phil means to love, like a bibliophile loves books. And so extremophiles really love extreme environments, okay? They can survive where most other life may not survive. One example would be what we call thermophiles. Thermophiles survive in extreme temperatures. So sometimes there's a hot spring with boiling water. Usually boiling water will kill most of the microbes. But there's a few microbes that live in extreme temperatures, either extreme hot or extreme cold, and we call those thermophiles, okay? Another group would be called halophiles. Now, if you've heard the term halogen in chemistry, you know halo is referring to salts. And so these can survive extreme salt conditions. We're talking about things that are so salty, most life would not be able to survive here. But halophiles can survive in extremely salty conditions that would kill most organisms. There's another group called methanogens. And one of the things we know that methanogens can do is they produce gases. One of those gases is methane that could kill other organisms. And so these can survive in their own extremely gassy environment. Methane gas is a gas that can kill a lot of organisms, but methanogens they are generators of methane, or they survive in extremely gassy conditions. Like some of the organisms that can exist well, they can produce a lot of the gases that are in our gut as they help break down materials. One of the things we know about a lot of methanogens is that they can survive off of carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. In many conditions, or in some instances, they live off of carbon dioxide and survive off of oxygen. They can produce oxygen, and as the oxygen dissipates, they can survive. They cannot live in oxygen environments or oxygen-rich environments. So they survive on carbon dioxide and die in oxygen-rich environments. That's true for some methanogens, not all of them. But one thing we know for sure is that methanogens can produce gases that can be toxic to many organisms, okay? And sometimes they're considered what we call anaerobes. Anaerobes means not, and aero meaning oxygen. They cannot survive in oxygen, so we call them anaerobes sometimes. Two more categories of these, and I'm running out of room, so I'm going to erase these three, and I'm going to add a couple of more categories of these extremophiles, okay? So we have halophiles that can survive in an extreme salty condition. We have thermophiles that can survive extreme temperatures, extreme hot or extreme cold. We have methanogens that survive off of carbon dioxide and can produce very toxic gases to other organisms. We also have a group called acidophiles. Acidophiles love acid environments, okay? So they survive extremely acidic conditions. Okay, we haven't talked a whole lot about pH. We haven't reviewed our chemistry chapter, but you should know a little bit of acids and bases and the pH scale. And when we're talking about things that are acidic, we're talking about acids are substances that give off hydrogen ions when they're in solution, and those hydrogen ions, which are essentially a proton, can interact with some of the other molecules that make up cells and some of these cellular or single-celled organisms. And those protons or hydrogen ions can mess up the chemistry of some of the molecules inside these organisms, and they kill most organisms. One of the things we know that strong acids do is that strong acids can denature proteins and cause them to stop functioning. And so acidophiles actually survive those extreme acidic conditions. Now we're talking about things where they can survive in an area that has a pH, that is less than 2.0 on the pH scale. So one of those organisms, by the way, is one that lives in your gut and your stomach called Helicobacter pylori. We're going to talk about Helicobacter pylori. But they live in the pyloric region of the stomach, which is extremely acidic. Most organisms can't survive there, so we call them acidophiles. The opposite of an acid is a base or an alkali, and so there's alkalophiles. And alkalophiles can also survive extreme pH, but they survive extremely basic conditions. Or what we say is alkaline conditions. Alkaline and alkali mean basic or base. And there are pHs that are very high on the pH scale that would kill most living organisms. So these can survive in a pH that is greater than 9.0, which would kill most life. But there's a group of organisms that thrive in that environment. They love that environment. They reproduce and survive in it. So we call them alkalophiles. Okay? So this is a group of organisms that belong under the category of Archaea. Now, all Archaea we know are prokaryotes. Some can have some eukaryotic traits, like a flagellum. They do have a cell wall that lacks peptidoglycans and proteoglycans, and many of them survive extreme environmental conditions called extremophiles, like acidophiles, love acid. Alkalophiles love basic conditions or alkaline conditions with a very high pH. Methanogens can survive very gassy conditions where the gases would be toxic to most life. Halophiles love extreme salt, and thermophiles love extreme temperatures. You should know each one of those categories, and you should know they all belong to the type of organism called Archaea. Now, I'm going to erase all this because we've got to get on to the next type of microbe that we're going to talk about. And the next type of microbes we're going to talk about are called bacteria. Bacteria are a very large group of living organisms on Earth. They are prokaryotes. They are ubiquitous. We find them everywhere. So we're going to talk a lot about bacteria. There's a lot to know about them. We're going to try to keep it short for now, but as we go through them, one of the things we know about all bacteria is that they are considered to be unicellular prokaryotes. So they are single-celled organisms that do not have a nucleus. They do not have a membrane. They don't have other membrane-bound organelles. Okay. Now, one thing that's really important is that bacteria do have a cell wall. So in addition to a cell membrane, they also have a cell wall, and this cell wall contains proteoglycans and peptidoglycans. And this unique characteristic of this cell wall can help us distinguish some bacteria from others, like gram-positive from gram-negative, and some of their behaviors and their survivability in certain conditions. Okay? So when we combine proteins and carbohydrates, we call those proteoglycans, and particularly peptidoglycans. Since a peptide is a single amino acid, these are sugars that have an amino group associated with them, not necessarily a protein, and a combination of those can make up the cell walls of many bacteria. Okay? Another thing we know about bacteria is that they're usually very small. They're usually 1/1000th the size of a eukaryotic cell. So if I were going to look at, say, a skin cell, or a typical eukaryotic cell that has a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, these things are tiny. They can be 1,000th of the size of a eukaryotic cell. Okay. Now, bacteria, there's so many categories and so many things to know about bacteria that, we're going to spend an entire section of our semester talking just about bacteria, and we're only going to scratch the surface. But one thing we know about, one way we can classify bacteria or distinguish them from each other is they can get their energy in 3 ways. Okay? So there's 3 ways that most bacteria get their energy. There's some that are called photosynthetic autotrophs. Troph is going to refer to how they get their food. Auto means self. They produce their own food source. They produce their own sugars for energy. And we're going to talk about why sugars are important and how we use them for energy when we do the chemistry chapter. Photosynthetic means that they are able to photosynthesize. Now, what this means is, when we talk about photosynthesis, one of the things you need to know is that what we call a simple sugar is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. One of the easiest or most common simple sugars for us to know is glucose. When I look at glucose, it has the chemical formula C6H12O6. Now, I can synthesize sugar from some carbon dioxide plus water. And if I take enough carbon dioxide and enough water, 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters, okay, let me rewrite this a little bit. I can make that go into a chemical reaction that could produce glucose. But it takes a lot of energy and it takes some enzymes. So one of the things I need for this is some enzymes. Otherwise, carbon dioxide and water can form other compounds. And I need energy. And that energy comes from photons of light. And when photons of light come in and they hit these molecules, they can cause the electrons to be rearranged, and the enzymes work on it also, and we can convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose. Anything that uses the photons of light to synthesize or make sugar out of carbon dioxide and water, we call that photosynthesis. And since these organisms are making their own food, we call them photosynthetic autotrophs. And some bacteria do that. Okay? Now, they do not do it with a membrane-bound organelle that plants have called a chloroplast. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in the future, but they're able to produce their own energy, their own sugars, using the energy of sunlight from carbon dioxide and water, and then that sugar they can break down for energy to make ATP. We've talked about that in previous classes, so I hope you understand some of that. We're going to review that when we do the chemistry chapter as well. So, one group, or one way that some bacteria can obtain their energy is by being photosynthetic autotrophs. They convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar for energy using photons of light. Now, another way that we can do this is what we call chemosynthetic autotrophs. Now, being an autotroph, they produce their own energy, but they're going to synthesize that energy using certain chemicals that are not carbon dioxide, not water, not oxygen. So we call these chemosynthetic autotrophs. Okay? And essentially what we know about chemosynthetic autotrophs is these guys use sunlight to make sugar. These guys use what we call inorganic molecules to make energy. Now again, we haven't done the chemistry chapter, but you're required to have chemistry usually before you take microbe. And when we talk about organic compounds, we talk about compounds that contain carbon and hydrogen, and usually oxygen, okay? In chemosynthetic autotrophs, they can make energy out of inorganic molecules. And a couple of those molecules would be things like sulfur or iron. So they can use things that are not carbon-containing things like sulfur compounds or iron, and then they use those to synthesize energy. And we'll talk about how and why when we do the metabolism of some organisms, okay? And then finally, another group of bacteria would be what we call heterotrophs. Now, I'm running out of room here, so I'm going to erase these two, and I'm going to write down what you need to know about heterotrophs. Hetero means different. We usually, sometimes when we talk about sexuality, we talk about someone who's heterosexual. Heterosexual means you like someone of another gender, and homosexual meaning same gender, okay? So heterotrophs get their energy from other organisms. They don't make their own energy, okay? So these organisms can depend on external sources of organic compounds for energy. Okay? So, some bacteria are going to live on other organisms and break down all the organic compounds, all the carbon and hydrogen containing compounds in that organism. Like the things that would break down the body of a decomposing organism, the bacteria that would grow on that would be called heterotrophs. They can't make their own energy from sunlight. They don't make energy out of inorganic compounds. They break down organic compounds for energy. Okay? So, for now, that's what we need to know about bacteria. They're unicellular prokaryotes. They're single-celled organisms that lack a nucleus and organelles. They have a cell wall that contains proteoglycans and peptidoglycans. They're very tiny in size, and they can get their energy in three ways. They can be photosynthetic autotrophs, chemosynthetic autotrophs, or heterotrophs, where they break down other organisms. Okay? Now, the next group of organisms we're going to talk about, the next type of microbe that we can talk about, is going to be called algae. So algae are a type of microbe. When we talk about algae, when you see algae growing on a rock or on the base of a river or stream, then you'll know what we're talking about. Now, one of the things that we know about algae is that they are photosynthetic eukaryotes. They have a true nucleus with a membrane around it. They have other membrane-bound organelles, and they're capable of turning sunlight, using photons of sunlight, to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar. So they're photosynthetic, okay? And one of the organelles that they can have inside of them, well, we'll talk about this at another time. One of the things we also know about algae is that they can reproduce sexually, some of them, or asexually. So they're capable of sexual or asexual reproduction. Whereas the two prokaryotes we talked about before are only capable of asexual reproduction. Okay? And that's not even true. There are some bacteria that can transmit plasmids, and they can reproduce by sex, or what we would call, bacterial sex. But we'll talk about that later. Okay? One of the things that we also know about algae is that they do have a cell wall. And what's important about their cell wall is it contains a compound called cellulose. And cellulose is when we take glucose molecules and stick them together in long chains, and the way that the glucose is stuck together is different than the way that humans can digest. We're incapable of digesting cellulose, but that's what the cell wall of a lot of algae is made up of. And one of the things that we also know about algae is that they can produce a lot of oxygen. As they photosynthesize, they're giving off oxygen. So here's what I think is unique, okay? Human beings and most animals, I'll draw some four-legged creature here, okay? We take in oxygen plus glucose and we produce energy. We use that to make a molecule called ATP. Again, we're going to talk about this in great detail when we do the chemistry chapter. In that process, we release carbon dioxide and water into the atmosphere. And then we have organisms like plants, algae, and bacteria, certain class of bacteria, that take carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, and they convert that into oxygen and glucose. So when we're using carbon dioxide and water and sunlight to photosynthesize to make glucose, plants, algae, and some bacteria can release oxygen into the atmosphere. So we're surviving off of what they exhale, and they're surviving off of what we exhale. Pretty crazy, but there is a balance of all of this. And when carbon dioxide levels go up in the atmosphere, we also get a blooming of lots of plants and algae and bacteria. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. And that's sort of the basis for all this global warming, climate change stuff, where we talk about the increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Up to a certain point, it's good for the environment and for the atmosphere. At what point it becomes detrimental is the discussion that's going on, and I'm not going to get into the politics of it. Anyway, so one of the things we know about algae is that they are capable of photosynthesis. They're eukaryotic cells. They have membrane-bound organelles. Their mode of reproduction is either sexual or asexual, and we'll discuss that when we get into algae in detail. But one thing that's important is that their cell wall is made up of a compound called cellulose. Really important stuff, and we'll get into the whys and hows later, okay? Now, the next type of microbe we can talk about. So we've talked about archaea, we've talked about bacteria and some details about bacteria, we've talked about algae. The next group of microbes we can talk about are fungi, okay? And I know people like to say fungi, but that's not how it's pronounced. It's incorrect. It's fungi, okay? From the term fungus. We don't say funguses in Latin, you would say fungi. So, now one of the things we know about fungi is that these are eukaryotes, for sure. And because of our previous lecture, you know that eukaryotes have membrane-bound nucleus and many membrane-bound organelles, okay? Another important feature of fungi is that they're multicellular, usually. A couple of other things about fungi, okay? They cannot produce their own energy. They don't. They have to absorb their nutrients from their environment. They absorb their nutrients from growing on other substances, like on other plants, or they absorb their nutrients from the ground, and then they use those nutrients to grow and develop. They don't eat. They don't photosynthesize. So they can't make energy, and they don't eat other things for energy. They absorb some of the compounds as those things are breaking down. That's why we usually find fungi where things like animals or plants are being broken down as they decompose. Something else that's important about fungi is that they have a cell wall. But it is made of a substance called chitin. Chitin is a protein that is also found in the shells, or what we call the exoskeleton, the skeleton that's on the outside of what we call arthropods. Arthropods are things that have, things like crabs. They have an exoskeleton, like crabs and lobsters and other things, the horseshoe crab. And so fungi have a cell wall that's made out of this same protein that's found in the exoskeleton of many of the arthropods, many things that have many jointed legs. Okay, finally, we could talk about them as reproducing through what we call asexual reproduction. I can't write right now. Come on, man. They reproduce asexually or sexual. And we'll talk about some that do either or when we get to study some fungi in a little bit more detail. When we talk about their asexual reproduction, they do what we call to sporulate. There's a whole group of fungi that form spores that they release into the environment, and those spores, when they fall on a food source, can start to grow and develop into a new fungus. Some mushrooms do that. My favorite fungus is a mushroom, and there's lots of mushrooms I love to eat, but there's other types of fungi out in the universe. Okay? Another type of microorganism that we can study. So hopefully you got all these notes. I'm going to erase this information, and we're going to talk about protozoa. So you should be able to list all these organisms and tell me these key details about them, at least in general. It's kind of a basic introduction to each one, and we're going to go into some of these in great detail as we go through the course. Okay, this is just sort of a general overview of different types of microbes. So one of the things we now know about protozoa is that they are single-celled eukaryotes. So the entire organism is made up of a single cell, and they can survive on their own. They don't need aggregates of cells like our bodies do. They have a true nucleus. They have lots of membrane-bound organelles. Okay. Now, they're basically like one-celled animals, is how some people refer to protozoa, is that they're one-celled organisms, one-celled animals, because they have the same organelles that our cells have. They don't usually have a cell wall. They don't have some of the characteristics of the other organisms that we've talked about previously. Now, one of the things that they exhibit is that they exhibit what we call motility, which is the ability to move around. And they exhibit that motility through a number of ways. One is they can use these things called a pseudopod. Pseudo means false or fake, and pod means foot. So pseudopods, when they move by pseudopods, what really happens is we can look at something like an amoeba. A good example would be like amoeba. The way amoeba move around is they're like this little jelly-ish type organism, a single-celled organism, and they can actually extend out part of their body like a little foot and then pull themselves along, and so they can extend out sort of this amorphous shape and just drag themselves along by sticking to whatever it is that they are stuck on, whatever surface they find themselves on. So another way that many of them move is through a flagellum. So a certain group of these guys can have a single hair-like structure sticking off the cell, and they can wiggle that and allow them to swim around. Similar to a sperm, but sperm are animal cells that are not protozoa, okay? And finally, some of them move around by what we call cilia. And if you remember, some organelles have all these little hair-like extensions of the membrane called cilia sticking off. And those cilia can be in little waves, kind of like you moving your arms and swimming through a fluid, or sometimes they can stick to a surface and help them move along. But the cilia can beat and move, and they all result in their ability to move around, or what we call motility. They move around by having pseudopods or little false feet where they can stick to a surface and drag themselves, through flagella that allows them to swim through substances, or by moving cilia, these little membrane-type extensions that allow them to swim around inside their fluids. A couple of things that we know about protozoa is most of them are heterotrophs, meaning they have to exist off of other organic compounds. But one of them, for example, there's one called euglena, is photosynthetic. They have an organelle in them called a chloroplast that allows them to photosynthesize. So these are autotrophs. They can make their own energy by using the energy of sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars. And the organelle that allows them to do that is the same organelle that can be found in plants called a chloroplast. We do know that some can reproduce through sex or asexually, but we're not going to get into that level of detail. Next, okay, there's two more organisms I want to talk about, or types of microbes that we can talk about. All right? And the next one we're going to talk about is really not alive. It does not exhibit all the characteristics of a living organism. And it's one that's of real interest to many people right now, which is a virus. So one of the types of microbes we can study, we've talked about all these types of microbes. You should be able to list them. Archaea, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and now we're going to talk about viruses, okay? Oh, and algae. I left algae off the list. So when we talk about a virus, something we need to know about viruses is viruses are considered to be what we call acellular. Anytime we have A at the beginning of the word, it means not. These are not cells. They are not alive. They're not considered a living organism. They're just this little thing that floats around and can use the machinery of a living cell to reproduce themselves. Okay. Now, a few things about them. And some people refer to these, by the way, as what we call obligate cellular parasites or intracellular parasites. Okay, let me rewrite that. Obligate intracellular parasites. What in the world is that? Okay. Obligate means that they have that there's, you must do it this way. Okay. Intracellular means inside of a cell, and parasite means they live off of that cell and very often can do harm to that cell. The opposite of a parasitic relationship is a symbiotic relationship. Okay. And very often, some of these organisms that we're going to, symbiotic and symbiosis. This means with, they live together, and both organisms benefit from the relationship. Kind of like the organisms that live in our gut live off the waste that we produce, and we live off of their waste. They can produce vitamins and other compounds that our body needs. And so we live together, and it's a win-win situation. We call that a symbiotic relationship. The opposite of a symbiotic relationship is a parasitic relationship. In a parasitic relationship, one organism benefits at the detriment of the other. The benefit of this one hurts the other. And think about that in our human relationships. Are you in a symbiotic one, or are you in a parasitic one? If you're in a parasitic relationship, get out, because they'll suck the life out of you. So we know that viruses can also sometimes be called obligate intracellular parasites, and they're not alive. Now, basically, this is what we mean. They don't have a cell wall. They have no cell membrane. So, some cells will have, for example, human cells. We have a nucleus, we have a cell membrane, and we have all these organelles inside of our cells. If we were going to look at a plant or some of these other organisms, then they can also have a wall around them. Now I'm drawing a eukaryotic cell, obviously because there's a nucleus. If we were talking about a prokaryote, it would not have a nucleus and organelles, but they would have a cell membrane and a cell wall. Okay? And the cell membrane is a complex mixture of carbohydrates and, lipids and proteins and carbohydrates and cholesterol. The cell wall can exist of a lot of proteoglycans and peptidoglycans, or of chitin, or of cellulose, depending on which organism they are. Well, viruses don't have either. Viruses have a little coat of protein. Let me grab another color here. And all these little protein molecules can come together and form an outer sort of surface that's made out of proteins. Called a capsid. And then inside of that is some kind of genetic material. And that genetic material can be DNA or RNA, okay? There's no organelles, there's no ribosomes, there's no other organelles, there's not even any cytoplasm. It's basically a protein coat with some DNA or RNA inside of it, okay? And that's it. There's DNA viruses, there are RNA viruses. And so they can't do all the functions like metabolism. They can't do protein synthesis or replicate their DNA. They can't do the things that cells do with all of their organelles. They can't metabolize. They can't do all of that without another cell. Now what happens is a virus can land on a cell. They can inject their genetic material, and then that genetic material and some of the proteins that they contain can cause that genetic material to enter into the DNA of the cell. And really what happens is a lot of times viruses kind of hijack a cell. They shut the cell's ability off to make its own proteins from its DNA, and then they synthesize the enzymes or stimulate the cell to replicate the viral DNA. They make a whole bunch of viral DNA or RNA, and then they will actually go through protein synthesis, and they'll make a whole bunch of the capsids, the protein coats, and then they will assemble that into full viral particles that have the DNA in it, or RNA, whatever the genetic material is, and then very often they'll kill the cell, and then these new viral particles will be released to infect other cells. So they literally hijack the cell, they come in, they stop everything that the cell is doing, and they make the cell produce only viral particles, viral proteins, and replicate the viral genome. They package that together, and that releases the virus. And usually they kill the cell in the process. That's why we say that they're obligate intracellular parasites. They hurt their host. They have to get inside the cell. It's required that they get inside the cell in order to replicate themselves. They don't have a cell wall or cell membrane. They don't have any organelles. All they are is a capsid or protein coat with some genetic material, either DNA or an RNA. And then they shut down the cell's production of its own proteins and force the cell to replicate the viral DNA, the viral proteins, or the viral RNA, I should say. And then they assemble themselves and then spread by killing that cell and releasing them, okay? So you need to know that about viruses. Now, finally, the last thing I guess I should mention is there's one more category of microbes that we could talk about that are called multicellular animal parasites. So hopefully you got this information down. I'm going to erase it. You can always pause the video if you need more time and then start the video back up. By the way, there are viruses that infect only bacteria. We refer to those as bacteriophage. So when it comes to virus, one group, we can say that a subcategory of viruses, I need to add this, they are called bacteriophage. Sometimes we just refer to them as phages. Okay? Bacteriophage are viruses that infect bacteria only. They do not infect eukaryotic cells like ours. So we're not susceptible to infection by these bacteria, by these viruses. They only affect or infect bacteria. So they're called bacteriophage, and they can enter a bacterium, use the bacterial cell as a host, reproduce themselves, and then kill the bacteria. And some of those are very useful in genetic engineering. Okay? All right. Finally, there are multicellular animal parasites. Well, we know what multicellular means. They're made up of many cells. They are found inside animals, and they are parasites. They harm the host on which they live. Okay? Now, these are not always microbes. Some of them are visible with the naked eye, but how we study them, how we understand them, is by using microbiological techniques. Okay? Sometimes they require certain types of staining or lighting, and we're going to talk about microscopy in the next lecture. These include a lot of small worms that cause problems, like roundworms that infect cattle and animals and humans. There are flatworms. Sometimes flatworms are called helminths. Helminth, like helmet, but helminths. And these during part of their life cycle, they are microscopic very often. But some can be seen or observed with the naked eye, some can't. And so we study them using a lot of microbiological techniques, and they're included in microbiology because of their etiology, the diseases that they can cause, and the way that we study them. So some of these multicellular animal parasites we'll talk about in great detail in the future. Most of y'all have heard of things like heartworms and roundworm infections, and so we'll talk about these eventually. Now, you guys need to know all the different categories of the microbes that we've been talking about. So you need to be able to run through the list. Archaea, there's bacteria, there's algae, there's fungi, there's protozoa, there's viruses, and multicellular animal parasites. You should know a little detail about each one of those, and we listed those, okay? You also need to know taxonomy, and what are the categories of taxonomy. And just remember that funny little sentence. You need to know, did King Philip come over from Great Spain? So it's domain, kingdom, phylum, did King Philip come over? So it's class, order, from, family, great, genus, Spain, species. Okay, be able to list those, and know the three main domains that I've talked about. You need to know archaea, bacteria, and then the eukarya, and the 4 categories of eukarya. Okay, just be able to list them. You don't need to know any details about them. Now, I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope that you learned something. I could probably do these videos much faster if I flashed everything up by PowerPoint and run through it in a few minutes, but the goal is learning. So I'm taking my time here. It may take a while for you to watch the videos, but hopefully you're able to get all the notes down and learn the information that you need to study so that you can do adequately well on your exams and carry this information into future semesters. So I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.